A host of global gatherings have been taking place in recent days, including here in Korea, as the world faces unprecedented challenges that threaten to further derail the rules-based international order, as warned by pundits. So what topped talks at the Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity this year? What was addressed at this year's Proliferation Security Initiative? And what is Korea doing to become a global pivotal state? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. We start the work week with a check on stories that made headlines over the past few days. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec here in the studio. Steven, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Right. I also have Jacco Zwetsloot with us. Jacco, it's good to see you again.
Nice to be here again. Thank you.
Right, Steven, we'll start with you then. I understand you were recently in Jeju Island to cover the Forum for Peace and Prosperity. Could you tell us a bit about this forum and, of course, its agenda this year?
The key words that kept coming up were peace and prosperity. I think that was the official slogan of the event, and a lot of the discussion revolved around how to achieve those very laudable goals. You know, those are things that everybody wants, but there's a lot of diverging discussion on how best to get there. In the panels that I attended, you know, I was mostly attending panels based on areas that are relevant to my coverage, such as, like, you know, South Korean foreign policy and supply chains and trade and things of that nature. Some of the topics that kept coming up were this kind of hardening division of the world into kind of what are referred to as like-minded countries, countries that are insisting on the maintenance of a so-called rules-based international order, and how to counter the opposing side of that, which is led by China and Russia, and how to safeguard things like the safe and stable passage of goods and people around the world, and how to maintain a peaceful international order amid the threats. You know, I was there just, I flew down there the day that North Korea had a failed satellite launch. North Korea is always a bit of a crapshoot when it comes to when they time things, but on this day it was actually quite convenient for me. It was early in the morning. I was able to fly out in the afternoon. It all ended up being fine. But you know, I think in big international gatherings like this, like more and more, we are seeing movement towards countries that tend to be democracies, that tend to be wealthier, that are banding together to try to cooperate to safeguard the things that are most important to the protection of peaceful and prosperous society. So I was able to take in a lot of stimulating discussion about that. It was a good experience.
Right, and staying with that, Jacco, in his opening address at the forum over in Jeju, former UN head Ban Ki-moon claimed that Washington and Beijing need to work together to address, and I quote, unprecedented global challenges. Now, that being said, first of all, do you believe that tensions here on the Korean Peninsula are perhaps standing at alarming levels?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about His Excellency Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's remark first. He said, to give the full sentence, the global challenges before us now are unprecedented. Any individual or country, however strong or resourceful one may be, cannot solve such problems alone. Now that's very broad. I mean, if we're talking about climate change or food security, clean air, the next pandemic, planning for that, these are certainly things that no country can take care of by themselves. They need to band together and really collaborate on this because no country has the tools to handle all that. And artificial intelligence is also a topic that fits into that. But it's hard to move forward on those global issues when you've got local or regional strife between and within countries. And that brings us, of course, to the Korean Peninsula. And as to whether the situation here is alarmingly tense, I want to quibble with the word alarming and say probably not. We've been in much tenser situations than now, like in 2017, 2010, and of course 1994. So would I like to see more work being done by all the parties in and around the Korean Peninsula to reduce and de-escalate tensions? Absolutely, I would, because I live here. But I don't see Korean people or governments are alarmed by the level of tensions that we're seeing at the moment. And I don't see any reason to suspect that a violent clash will happen soon. Doesn't mean it won't, but I don't expect it to.
And hopefully you're right. Steven, also regarding Ban Ki-moon's words, and speaking, of course, within your capacity as a journalist who has been covering events here in this part of the world, what do you suppose are the prospects of a thaw in tensions between Washington and Beijing?
Well, just over the weekend at the 샹그릴라 dialogue in Singapore, there was the handshake heard. I'm not sure if it was around the world, but in some portion of the world, between U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and his Chinese counterpart. It was interesting that some people in my line of work kind of jumped on this as a sign of peace, but then I think at least Austin was quick to kind of downplay it and say, like, you know, we encounter lots of people at these sorts of gatherings and it's customary to shake hands. It's because the two of us are engaging in this outward show of cordiality doesn't mean anything fundamental about the relationship between the two countries. It's a big question as to where U.S.-China relations will go from now. The U.S. is about to head back into another election cycle, as they seem to be doing with quite a lot of regularity. So there remains to be seen there. But you know, it seems like, at least on the domestic political fronts in the U.S., a harder line on China is one of the rare things that the two main political parties seem able to agree on. And just fundamentally, the U.S. and China seem to have a lot of non-overlapping interests. They seem to have some quite fundamental differences in how they see very key matters like Taiwan, for example, or North Korea as another example. So I think probably both sides can see the benefit of not engaging in an all-out violent clash, as Jacco alluded to. I don't think anything like that is in the offing, but I don't see a whole lot of room for any real rapprochement, especially if the U.S. were to go through with something like banning TikTok or taking any other kind of punitive trade-based measures against China.
Right. And are your thoughts equally as pessimistic, Jacco, do you think, with regard to tensions between Washington and Beijing?
Sorry, are you asking if I'm pessimistic?
Right.
Yeah, I don't see a thaw happening anytime soon, but both sides know that any escalation is deleterious to both of their financial and other stability and health. So I think we'll see this tension continue for a while, but I don't expect to see anything escalate from there.
Right, and moving forward, Jacco, the island, Jeju, was also host to the Proliferation Security Initiative last week. Now, again, for the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with this initiative, do tell us a bit about it and what looks to be its significance amid the current security concerns.
Yeah, the proliferation, it's something I always hate to say in full. I like to say PSI. It's 20 years that it's been around now, and it goes back to in the early 2000s, in 2002, an unmarked North Korean ship was carrying Scud missiles to Yemen when it was stopped by the US Navy, but the Navy had to let it go because there was no basis in international law to seize those weapons from it or to impound the ship. And so that led US President George W. Bush at the time to launch this Proliferation Security Initiative, the PSI, in 2003, to try to stop international trade of weapons of mass destruction. So we're talking missiles, nuclear and chemical weapons and biological weapons through multilateral cooperation. Right? And so now we've got 105 nations around the world that work together on this PSI, and the motto there is preventing proliferation through cooperation. So notably, many PSI interdictions over the years have targeted North Korean vessels, apparently moving parts of things that could become weapons of mass destruction. Now, PSI is not without criticism. North Korea obviously doesn't like it, because it's often the target, and neither do China, India, and Indonesia. Interestingly, Russia actually has been part of the 105 nations, although Russian experts were excluded from a PSI session held in Italy in October last year, and I could see no sign in the media that they were present at Jeju Island for the 20th anniversary last week. So in the midst of the current security concerns, the meetings and the drills held on Jeju Island were significant. Firstly, because it showed that more than ever, this is a relevant thing, and it's growing, and it's actually not only growing deeper, but it's also broadening. It's looking at things like cryptocurrency theft and financial movements, things that can pay for weapons of mass destruction. So those funding issues are now just as important as actually moving hardware by ship. So after 20 years, it's still going strong, and it's broadening and deepening to stop the spread or limit the spread of weapons of mass destruction. And that's quite significant that it happened right here in South Korea.
Right. And staying with that, this latest PSI, as Jacco mentioned, gathering that is, it was hosted by Jeju Island. It was actually the first to be held here in this part of the world, that is Asia. That being said, Steven, do you think that Korea is indeed working towards becoming a pivotal global state?
It depends on what you mean by pivotal. I would say Korea is pivotal in the sense that it does carry a fair amount of influence in terms of Korea is culturally one of the more influential countries in the world probably at this point in terms of a soft power appeal. Korea is a world leader in what is arguably the most pivotal technology in semiconductors. The country holds a fair amount of clout in its ability to produce and control some of the most technologically advanced chips in the world that are needed to run cars and appliances and all kinds of other things. So Korea is definitely influential, but going back to kind of like drilling down on the definition of the word pivotal, one question that I have is, if you look at almost all Korean foreign policy visions, if you really read them, it's, especially the stuff that's phrased for a domestic audience, it's expressed pretty clearly in terms of self-interest. It's that it makes sense, even when you look at things like overseas development assistance, it's like it makes sense for Korea to be doing this because this is going to give Korea more influence and open up markets for exports and ensure the smooth movement of Korean goods and ensure a peaceful regional environment for Korea to thrive in. As long as this country is dictating its foreign policy in terms of self-interest, its influence can be broad, but it might be a little bit limited. If the Yoon administration were to go as far as to say, not only are we going to seek to advance and protect our own interests on the foreign policy stage, we are going to really be leaders. We're going to act more in terms of values and more in terms of, speak more in the language of international solidarity, because that comes with sacrifice. That might introduce a scenario where South Korean policymakers might have to do something that is not directly in the interest of the country in the name of protecting some bigger foreign policy initiative or some bigger international goal. So that to me is a really interesting question that I think over the remaining 4 years of the Yoon administration we should see some kind of progress towards.
Right, so I suppose we'll have to wait and see then. Jacco, Korea, it's also seeking to become one of the globe's biggest arms dealer. What do you suppose are the broader implications of this particular ambition? Yeah,
it's a good question. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, South Korea is already the world's #8 weapons exporter. And from that same report, I learnt that numbers 4, 5, 6, and 7 are China, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, respectively. So it's certainly up against some very strong competitors in global exports of arms, well entrenched and with large economies of scale. But what are the broader implications? Well, one factor that really helps South Korean military systems and weapons sell well overseas, especially to Western nations and their allies, is the fact that a lot of these, the systems made in South Korea are interoperable with American systems. So because the South Korean military works so closely with the US military through its alliance and through the joint combined drills, this interoperability of systems makes it easy to use in other places like NATO countries, for example. Now, right now, a lot of these countries, including the United States, are giving and shipping their weapons for free to Ukraine to help to defend that country from the invasion by Russia. South Korea is not yet, hasn't yet begun to ship any military aid, but is instead selling weapons to the countries that are giving it to replenish their stocks, so to countries like the United States and NATO allies. So that means that South Korea is really catching a windfall from the war, but it also suggests that if that war reaches a stalemate or an armistice or even a peace treaty, that it's hard to see the current demand for weapons continuing for a long time. And that means that South Korea's desire to be a major arms exporter and climb up from current 8th place to even 4th place, it's going to be difficult. And so Korea really has a short window of time to differentiate itself from other countries in terms of price or quality or other factors to keep that momentum going beyond the end or a slowing down of the current military crisis in Europe, whenever that may be.
Right, and Steven, Jacco just mentioned Ukraine. Staying with that, the European Union's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, this past weekend claimed that he had talks with Defense Minister Lee Jong-sop on the sidelines of the 샹그릴라 dialogue in Singapore with regard to potential ammunition support for Ukraine. Now, do you foresee a shift perhaps in Korea's policy of no lethal weapon support for Ukraine in the near future? And if you do, how does this shift in policy look to affect regional security dynamics, if I may?
This is a very interesting question. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, where since the war in Ukraine started, Korea has been steadfast in that Seoul would only provide non-lethal aid. And if you want to parse their motivations there, you could say it's because they want to maintain, there are some important trade ties with Russia. And South Korean policymakers want to kind of keep their options open to a certain extent, but that does create friction with these claims to be a part of this international order of like-minded countries protecting a rule-based international order and wanting to make a more decisive show of resistance to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I think the Yoon administration has been very clear that they want to be on the side of NATO and the U.S. and they're squeamish about taking the kind of approach that an India, for example, has taken in being reluctant to outwardly condemn what Russia is doing and reaping a kind of economic windfall as a result. I'm not in the prediction business. I don't feel quite comfortable saying what will or won't happen here. I can just say that this will probably end up being, this has all the seeds of being a kind of watershed decision for this administration where whatever they do here could really set a precedent, and it could signal a more decisive embrace of a value-based international perspective and policy from this administration, or it could signal that Seoul is not quite ready to yet embrace this more leadership-minded orientation and is still operating on a sort of more self-interested mode.
Again, time will tell.
If I could jump in, I think there are countries and leaders around the world who are keen to remind Korea and President Yoon that this country, in fact, benefited from precisely that kind of interventionism back in 1953 when it was under invasion by North Korea in a desire to bring South Korean territory into North Korea and unite it all under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. That in a way there are some parallels here with what's happening in Ukraine, and that I think some international observers have complained that it looks like South Korea has a bit of a short memory in this case by not being so decisive and paying forward or paying back that which it received in 1950.
And that same example was invoked, I think it was a couple of years ago now, when South Korea announced the decision to accept people who were fleeing Afghanistan. I don't recall the exact number, but there was I think something like several dozen people who had worked closely with the South Korean operation in Afghanistan, and when they were granted residency here, I believe it was the Minister of Justice, he directly invoked that history and he said there was a time when we sought international help and now it is our turn to provide this kind of international help. And I think a lot of international observers took that as a great sign of maturity and a great sign of compassion by extending the same kind of assistance that this country had once sought. And as Jacco mentioned, it'll be interesting to see if that same scenario can play itself out again.
Right, indeed. Meanwhile, Jacco, North Korea, it was recently elected to the World Health Organization's executive board. Now, as a pundit who has been covering issues related to North Korea, what are your thoughts regarding this latest election?
Yeah, this is such a fascinating development, especially given North Korea's history with the World Health Organization, both in the 1990s, but even more recently during the pandemic. So a little bit of context, the World Health Organization first opened its Emergency and Humanitarian Action Office in North Korea in 1997 at the tail end of the big famine in the mid-1990s to help relieve that situation there. And the World Health Organization has been active in North Korea ever since. So then we fast forward to February 2020, the pandemic has just started, and North Korea's mission in Geneva met with the World Health Organization directly to talk about efforts to prevent the pandemic reaching North Korea. This is after North Korea had already closed its borders to people coming in. That happened already in January 2020. And I believe, by the way, that the WHO's foreign staff based in Pyongyang had since left. but the office has been kept open by local staff who've been feeding statistics back to Geneva about how the pandemic's been going. Now, of course, North Korea claimed well into the pandemic that they had no cases of COVID whatsoever, and that changed last year, but not for long, because only 3 months after that, Kim Jong-un announced total victory. So it's been an interesting time to watch North Korea observing its interactions with the WHO, especially when the WHO offered free vaccinations through COVAX, and North Korea either rejected or didn't answer that. So here we have this irony that now North Korea is one of the members of the executive board of the WHO. But yeah, we have to remember that in United Nations bodies, all member states, all countries have the right to run and to serve in committees and boards, just like North Korea is doing, without favour and regardless of status. So in this case, North Korea will be one of 10 on the executive board, and that will last for 3 years, and that board helps to decide the agenda of the annual World Health Assembly. But North Korea is not doing this by itself. It's one of 10, so let's not imagine that North Korea is going to hijack the whole board and run it for its own interest. But I think that engagement like this can lead to positive outcomes, so I hope that this kind of enhanced engagement with the WHO can push North Korea to be a responsible actor and to serve the health needs of its own population as well as those of other developing countries. So let's see how it turns out.
Right, and in the meantime, though, Stephen, what has been the response from the international community with regard to North Korea's election to the board?
I'm not sure there's been any kind of comprehensive response, but one notable response to this has been this appointment becoming a little bit of fodder in the American political conversation, perhaps a rekindling of the 2017 bromance between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and then U.S. President Donald Trump, who recently congratulated Kim on this, and then that Trump's congratulation of him became kind of drew some criticism from his right-wing political rivals in the U.S. as they gear up for another election campaign that we alluded to earlier. As Jacco gave a much more thoughtful and comprehensive assessment of this matter, so I think we can leave it at that and not
South Korea did make a complaint. I think it expressed disappointment with North Korea's election to this board and said that it thought it was inappropriate. But
right,
as I said, I mean, that's the same with any UN body. We've got Iran, for example, I think recently on the Human Rights Council. Yeah. Things like that happen. I mean, every country can apply for any of these boards.
Right. Well, hopefully it will provide North Korea with an opportunity to better engage with its...
and become more transparent too, that'd be good.
Right, hopefully. We'll keep our fingers crossed for that. All right, Jacco, as always, thank you very much for your insights. And Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Now, tomorrow we commemorate Memorial Day here in Korea, so we'll see you the day after. That is Wednesday. Join us then.